Declare recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Oversight of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, and the other efforts to strengthen national security in the United States. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous material to the chair for inclusion in the record. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This hearing notice identified 2 panels. The first witness, Assistant Secretary Rosen, will testify this morning in an unclassified setting in this hearing room. The hearing notice also identified a second witness panel that we anticipate will occur after the first series of votes to discuss the classified portions of the CFIUS report. With that, so to understand, we're going to do this in 2 different settings, 2 different rooms, 2 different panels, 1 hearing. However, pursuant to Clause 2G2 of House Rule 11, the committee must take a vote to move into a classified session to discuss testimony that has the potential to endanger national security. We will take that vote now in order to expedite the hearing later this afternoon. With that, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2G2, I move that when we return from the first series of floor votes this afternoon, the remainder of the hearing will be closed to all persons other than members of the House, staff of the committee with TSSCI clearances, the official reporter, and the witnesses and their counsels and representatives with appropriate TSSCI clearances. We will close this portion of the hearing because the testimony we expect to receive may include material designated as classified, the disclosure of which would endanger national security. The question is on closing the remainder of the hearing to the public. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hill.
Aye.
Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Luptemeyer. Mr. Luptemeyer votes aye. Mr. Huizinga. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Norman. Mr. Muser. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Garbarino. Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim votes aye. Mr. Donalds. Mr. Flood. Mr. Flood votes aye. Mr. Lawler. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn votes aye. Ms. De La Cruz. Ms. De La Cruz votes aye. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Ogles. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters votes aye. Mrs. Velasquez. Mrs. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Scott. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster.
Aye.
Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty.
Aye.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Ms. Talib. Mr. Torres. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams. Mr. Nickel. Ms. Pedersen. Ms. Pedersen votes aye. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Sessions, you are not recorded.
Please register me as an aye vote.
Mr. Sessions is recorded as aye.
Mr. Huizinga.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recorded as an aye.
Mr. Huizinga is recorded as aye.
Mr. Barr.
Aye.
Mr. Barr is recorded as aye.
Any other member wishing to record their vote?
Ogles. Aye.
Mr. Ogles is recorded as aye.
Any other members not recorded that wish to be recorded or wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 34.
Majority having voted in the affirmative, we'll move into a classified session later this afternoon after the first series of votes on the House floor. Room HVC 301 of the Capitol Visitor Center has been prepared for the closed portion of this committee's hearing. If there is no first vote series at 1:30, the chair will announce the exact timing of that closed portion at a later time in this hearing. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Today, we'll conduct oversight of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, and examine efforts to strengthen our national security. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Rosen, for being here, and I look forward to your testimony. CFIUS operates under a dual mandate to address national security risks in foreign investments and maintain the United States' commitment to an open investment climate. 5 years ago, Congress enacted the most far-reaching changes to CFIUS in a generation. This legislation, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA, extended CFIUS's jurisdiction to certain non-controlling investments as well as real estate transactions near sensitive government sites. FIRMA also made operational updates so that CFIUS officials could complete investment reviews more effectively. This included creating the position that you now occupy, Mr. Rosen. These efforts were carefully tailored to legitimate national security risks. Yet, at the same time, FIRMA underscored the United States' longstanding embrace of foreign investment. In addition to reforming how we look at inbound transactions, Congress also strengthened national security through a major outbound policy, the Export Control Reform Act. This was the first long-term reauthorization of export controls in nearly 4 decades. This legislation, which passed with FIRMA, now serves as a legal basis for our export controls against adversaries like China and Russia. Like all previous CFIUS laws, FIRMA recognized that an outside investor may pose a risk to the country receiving investment. That's common sense. But now the Biden administration is proposing to use CFIUS to regulate Americans' investments into China. That's nonsense. Congress has repeatedly dismissed this idea, and for good reason. If you oppose Beijing's state-owned enterprises, you want more Western investment into China, not less. And if you're concerned about Chinese technology companies, you want more Americans in control of them, not fewer. And if you want to expand the reach of U.S. sanctions and export control laws, you want Americans in Chinese boardrooms who are required to comply with these laws, not CCP cronies and not Saudi princes. This is precisely why Xi Jinping has been attacking Western influence in Chinese companies. The Biden administration's outbound investment proposal will only help him achieve that goal more quickly. That's not in U.S. interest, that's not in global economic interest. And since it was first floated a few years ago, the premise of an outbound CFIUS has lacked the basic facts necessary to warrant such a move. If you hear of loopholes and gaps, there's not a single real-world example. In May, I sent a letter to Secretary Yellen asking for data to justify outbound restrictions. Not one of my questions was answered, and that's because there is no data to begin with. Mr. Rosen, you have an unenviable job. Now that outbound regulations have been announced through executive order, Treasury must seek to avoid a disaster in its implementation. And I think you're the right person to do this and make the best out of a really tough situation. You know as well as I do that we must use time-tested tools to get tough on China, not novel concepts. We need clear rules of the road and action based on data and facts, not political gamesmanship. And as I've said all along, to outcompete China, we cannot become more like the Chinese Communist Party. We must double down on our commitment to free people and free markets. That's the smart, balanced approach that is bipartisan and time-tested. Taking concrete action is the toughest approach to countering the generational threat posed by the CCP. I look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Rosen, today about how we can work together to achieve our shared goals. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. My Democratic colleagues and I have long worked in a bipartisan way to protect our national security interests by closely monitoring foreign investments. We all agree that the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, is a critical tool towards that end. That's why I'm disappointed that once again, extreme MAGA Republicans are trying to shut down the government. If they are successful, everyone in this country will be at greater security risk. I'm so deeply concerned about the legislation that extremist Republicans here in Congress and in states like Florida and South Dakota are jamming through to protect certain groups of people with no connection to actual security risk from purchasing land. Let me be clear. This approach would do nothing for national security, would waste valuable resources, and in many cases is simply racist. CFIUS and its resources should be focused on actual, legitimate threats to our nation's security, not on borrowing individuals from economic opportunities on the sole basis of their national origin. Next, I want to discuss outbound investments and whether American investments are being used to prop up U.S. adversaries. I've applauded the Biden administration's latest actions on this issue. For years, committee Democrats and I have sounded the alarm on how private equity and venture capital funds are being used to finance military and adversarial tech in the People's Republic of China. The president's executive order is a good first step, but more can be done. For instance, an outbound screening framework could also address U.S. company supply chain resiliency, how workers are treated overseas, and climate risk, all of which deeply affect our economy and security. In addition, the administration could review certain passive forms of investment, such as mutual funds and index investments, so Americans know whether and how their hard-earned savings support adversarial nations. We also need to review the investments that private equity and venture capital firms are making in China-based companies, because they may also pose ongoing threats. I hope my Republican colleagues agree that if we're truly to confront our adversaries, we need to ensure that CFIUS agencies are adequately funded and that trillions of dollars in American capital markets are not working against our interests. Lastly, I want to be clear that as we discuss national security, CFIUS is only one of many areas we should be concerned about. Not only are we weeks away from an extreme MAGA Republican shutdown that will pose grave harm to our nation's security, but Republicans are leading the charge to halt supplemental aid to support Ukraine in its fight against Putin's unlawful invasion. If they succeed, this will cause immeasurable harm to U.S. national security interests and democratic values, and only embolden countries like China. So I urge my colleagues to reverse course immediately, before it's too late. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions, Mr. Lukemeyer, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the Communist Chinese Party poses the most significant strategic threat to the United States, both economically and militarily. For years, based on wishful thinking, Americans have been told the rise of China would be peaceful, that through trade and increased business, American interests could coexist with the CCP. As demonstrated by the Chinese spy balloon, which flew directly over my district in Missouri, Americans now know otherwise. Under Xi Jinping, the CCP seeks to undermine the United States at every turn. As we work to maintain our strategic advantages over the CCP, CFIUS plays a critical role ensuring those foreign direct investments don't end up putting sensitive U.S. technology, data, or real estate into hostile hands. To that end, I'm concerned about the integrity of the CFIUS process as it's being eroded, and the cracks in our national security screening process are getting worse at a time when they should be getting better and tougher. We must ensure that CFIUS resources are focused on identifying and stopping investments dangerous to our national security, especially by the CCP. Secretary Rosen, I look forward to discussing that with you today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions, Mrs. Beatty, for 1 minute.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Waters, for holding this hearing to conduct oversight of the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, or CFIUS. I want to highlight 3 points. First, we must ensure that the agencies that make up CFIUS remain fully funded with sufficient resources to carry out their vital work. Secondly, we must make sure that CFIUS remains a narrowly focused tool that protects the United States from legitimate threats to national security. And thirdly, I want to take this time to re-emphasize the points made by Ranking Member Waters about the unquestionable importance of CFIUS as a critical tool in our national security tech toolbox. I look forward to hearing from you, Assistant Secretary Rosen, about not only the work of this committee, but about protecting our national security. I yield back.
So the lady yields back. Today we welcome the testimony of the Honorable Paul Rosen, Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Investment Security. Assistant Secretary Rosen, we thank you for taking time to be here. We'll recognize you for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of your testimony. And without objection, your written testimony will be made part of the record. Assistant Secretary Rosen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Waters, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide an update on the work of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. CFIUS, as many have mentioned here this morning, is a critical national security tool that conducts reviews of foreign investment for national security risks. The Secretary of the Treasury is the chair of the committee, which is comprised of the heads of 9 executive branch departments and offices, with additional offices playing critical roles as national security demands. As Assistant Secretary, I lead and help execute the Secretary's role as chair in that regard. Whenever necessary, the committee takes action to address national security risks while maintaining the status of the United States as the world's top destination for foreign direct investment. The committee protects national security by screening foreign direct investment from any country. And by law, we analyze the facts and circumstances of each transaction on a case-by-case basis. Our risk analysis is robust, and it is focused on 3 factors. First, the potential threat emanating from the foreign investor. Second, the national security vulnerabilities presented by the U.S. business. And third, the consequence of the transaction to national security. For example, if the committee learned that an investor with ties to a hostile foreign actor was going to gain a controlling stake in a critical government contractor, the committee would almost certainly take action to address that national security risk. Few risks, however, are as black and white. It is for this reason that our case-by-case assessment and due diligence is so important. When we identify risks, our mandate is to resolve them, whether by mitigating through enforceable restrictions on the parties or as a last resort by recommending that the president block or unwind a transaction. As designed by Congress, the committee does not implement a blanket country or sector-by-sector prohibition. Through our case-by-case approach, we actually gain greater insight into the ability to address actors and activities of concern. Over the years, as the national security threat environment has evolved, so has CFIUS. Most recently, Congress enhanced our authorities with the Bipartisan Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, as was mentioned. The committee has dedicated substantial time and resources to the successful implementation of FIRMA and the efficient processing of a caseload that is at an all-time high. Prior to the enactment, the committee processed 237 transaction filings in 2017, and 5 years later, we've nearly doubled to 440 case filings last year. Among other things, FIRMA provided the committee with important authorities over certain non-controlling but non-passive investments into sectors of particular importance, which had previously fallen outside the committee's jurisdiction. It also provided the ability to review certain transactions involving real estate in close proximity to sensitive facilities, such as military bases. We appreciate the continued bipartisan congressional support for our mission, which has enabled our office to continue growing across all functions. Since I was confirmed, I have sought to ensure that CFIUS is marshaling all available tools to support our national security mission. For example, when CFIUS reviews a transaction that raises national security concerns, we can and do mitigate those transactions by requiring certain measures to be taken. These measures are typically formalized in what's called a national security agreement or mitigation agreement, which places requirements and conditions on the parties that are enforceable. And we do not stop in our mission after a mitigation agreement is signed, and the parties should not stop either. In monitoring the parties' compliance, we routinely conduct site visits, collect documents and information, and engage with third-party monitors and auditors to ensure that agreements are upheld. While preventing violations from occurring is our primary focus, the availability of robust remediation and enforcement tools is necessary because the potential harm of a breach could have on national security. As I conclude my remarks, you have my commitment that the committee will continue to use every available tool to protect national security in the United States. 5 years later, after the passage of FIRMA, we continue to assess what additional tools or authorities may be necessary to protect national security, and I look forward to working with the committee on these efforts. And while I'm mindful that strict confidentiality obligations that Congress imposed on aspects of our work exist, I look forward to answering questions I can in the open setting and understand there will be a follow-on classified and closed-door setting to address additional matters. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you. We'll now move to member questions. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Assistant Secretary Rosen, Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, has years of experience managing restrictions related to outbound investment and other financial transactions, right?
Correct.
And that's the case even when it's not qualified as a blocking transaction or a blocking sanction. So, for instance, OFAC administers outbound investments prohibitions against Chinese military companies, does that well. It manages those restrictions for Russian energy entities and does that well, right? So the Office of Investment Security, does it have that like-kind experience?
We have similar experience. I'm sorry, is your question, do we have the same experience as OFAC, Mr. Chairman?
Right.
We have different experience and different authorities, sir.
Right. So we have an agency, OFAC, that does this well. Yet we're trying to build a regime with an entity that doesn't have that like-kind experience. Is that a fair assumption?
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Isn't that what you're trying to stand up, is a like-kind capacity that OFAC has?
it is similar, but also has differences in many regards. One of the similarities, as you know, is standing up this executive order under IEPA, which is obviously the same authority that OFAC operates under, but the way the executive order is written is a bit different.
So why not just do it through OFAC? We've done this for generations, so why not use OFAC?
Well, we believe that the Office of Investment Security has important lessons learned from the CFIUS, from operating CFIUS, and in addition to, we don't, in terms of the executive order and what it requires, it sets up a notification and prohibition regime, and OFAC, while not under my jurisdiction, as you point out, is more of sort of a blocking and sectoral-based program.
All right, so I think that, thank you for the answer. Mr. Rosen, what are the specific differences between artificial, let's just drill into this, because the specifics of implementation are going to matter. They're going to affect industries more broadly than just what the executive order says. So just let's get into the specifics. We have a big discussion on the Senate side about artificial intelligence. What are the specific differences between an artificial intelligence that helps a drone operator identify a military target on an image and an artificial intelligence that helps a doctor identify cancer on an MRI?
Mr. Chairman, it's a good question, and the way the executive order approaches artificial intelligence is that, as you know, it identifies it as one of the categories of concern for U.S. investments. We are in the midst of a rulemaking process. We are working to collect information so that we can strike the right balance, because what we want to get at is the PRC's use of artificial intelligence for military modernization. We
Okay.
understand it's a dual.
But that's done through companies, and OFAC has a regime where we identify companies and people, and we target companies and people. And then we're setting up a regime where we're trying to identify through technology companies and people to target them. It seems redundant to me, sitting on Capitol Hill, having been through the FIRMA reauthorization process that you've done a good job of implementing huge facets of. And so, in technical terms, how can you hold these things mutually exclusive when you use artificial intelligence in one company one way and another company in another way? It's difficult, right? And so setting up this new expertise with this new approach as a result of the executive order could be tricky and cumbersome, time-consuming, when we should be using a time-tested tool of OFAC.
Mr. Chairman, all important questions that you raise, all questions that we have grappled with through implementation and working on the executive order. One of the important distinctions in this executive order is that what we want to get at is, in addition to the issues that you identified in terms of companies we know about, we want to get at the development of these technologies before they're on an export control list, before they're on a sanctions list. We don't want the PRC and American investments to help fund the development of the next generation of military technology for the PRC.
Yeah.
That's what we were trying to get at.
Right. So rather than using a CFIUS process that is cumbersome already for inbound investment, we have a capacity problem, right? And that's not specific to budgets. It's not specific to this administration. We have a capacity problem given the amount of investment. Why not use, and this is what I'll just raise, why not use the time-tested tool of OFAC and enhance that? Enhance that with budget, capacity, and everything else. That's been our approach. That's what our approach was as a matter of export controls and our reauthorization of FIRMA, and I think that's what we should return to. That's my clear message I'm sending to you. And now with that, I'll go to the ranking member for her time for questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosen. I think that we all have so many questions and so many concerns on this issue. And there are many that I could talk about, but I thought I would bring up one that I and Chairman Brown of the Senate Banking Committee sent Secretary Yellen regarding the announced merger of the PGA Tour, DP World Tour, and Levitt Golf. The transaction largely benefits Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, and thus its government. And as you and Secretary Yellen know, Saudi Arabia has a repressive government known for chilling dissent, jailing dissidents, and enacting draconian punishments. Under Section 721 of the Defense Production Act, CFIUS has jurisdiction over transactions that result in foreign government control, transactions involving companies that maintain or collect sensitive personal data of U.S. citizens, and certain real estate transactions, among others. So I'm asking now whether CFIUS assess the nature of this merger to determine whether it has jurisdiction over the transaction, and if so, did you resolve any national security risk related to the transaction? And what did Mohammed bin Salman have to do with this merger?
Ranking Member Waters, thank you for raising this issue. I know this is an important issue for you and many others. As you point out, we do have tools at CFIUS, thanks to Congress's bipartisan effort, to get at, on a case-by-case basis, risks, particularly as they relate to foreign government control transactions, sensitive personal data, as you've mentioned. Those are all critical components of how we assess and look at a review. Of course, CFIUS and FIRMA impose strict confidentiality, and so while I can't get into any specific transaction in this open setting, I want to reiterate our commitment to make sure that this committee knows that we look at issues that pose risks on a case-by-case basis, particularly as it relates to data and some of the issues that you raised, and would reserve the balance of a discussion for the closed-door setting.
Thank you. Let me just ask, did the brutal murder of Khashoggi by Mohammed bin Salman, his direction, was that taken into consideration at all? He was an American citizen.
Again, I can't address any particular case in this context. As I laid out in my opening, we do engage in a very robust analysis that looks at the threat posed by the foreign acquirer and the vulnerability to the U.S. business to assess a national security
Does
risk.
the Saudi government benefit from this merger? That's one of the issues that certainly must be considered by us when we allow for these kinds of investments. Does the Saudi government benefit from the merger?
Again, Madam Chairman, as a matter of statute, I'm unable to address any particular case, but would welcome a further discussion as permitted in a closed-door setting.
Well, let me just say, I really do appreciate the work that you and the president have done on this issue of foreign investments. But I want you to know we've got to be tougher. We've got to be a lot tougher. There's information that I cannot disclose in this meeting where I believe that our adversaries are continuing to have investments and purchases that I think are not in the best interest of this country. And so even though I consider what you've done very good, we've got to be tougher and we've got to be more focused because I think that our country, our democracy, et cetera, is at stake unless we really, really bear down on the investments from adversaries and others. So I thank you for being here today. But my message is get tougher. I yield back.
The ranking member yields back. We'll now go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Ms. Rosen, welcome to the committee. We're delighted that you're here. Mr. Rosen, does CFIUS have jurisdiction and review over what I might call real estate purchases that take place in agricultural lands?
Thank you, Congressman. CFIUS has three primary aspects of jurisdiction, and we do have jurisdiction over certain real estate transactions that involve agricultural land, and they occur sort of in two primary ways. One is the acquisition of a foreign person of a U.S. business that, and acquisition results in control, broadly speaking, of that U.S. business, whether that's an agricultural business or otherwise. The other way that we get at jurisdiction of this kind of activity is through the real estate jurisdiction that Infirma Congress provided to CFIUS, which provides jurisdiction for pure real estate transactions unrelated to a business in close proximity to a sensitive facility. And we work closely with our counterparts at DoD to assess what is a sensitive facility. We have recently updated our regulations to expand the list of sensitive facilities and now have some 875,000 square miles of coverage in the United States for pure real estate jurisdiction.
Mr. Rosen, is that related to individuals who might have foreign, look for, because they're not a United States citizen, or is that directly related to where there is a government entity behind that transaction at some point?
So on the control side that I mentioned, we look very closely at who the foreign acquirer is, who is doing the buying, what are their connections, what do we know about them from a threat perspective, working with the DNI and others. And so in that context, we look very closely on a case-by-case basis to determine what are they getting and what are they going to have access to, who are their commercial relationships with, what do we know about them, who sits on their board and the like. So we very much look at the identity of the purchaser in that context. In the real estate context, we're looking at that, but what we're also looking very closely at is the proximity question. And we work very closely with our partners to assess, is this a proximity concern? What is the threat based on that analysis that I talked about, sir?
And certainly in that, the control of the money. Mr. Rosen, I have a bill that is with Congressman Ronnie Jackson, where we have proposed that the Secretary of Agriculture sit on your committee, your board, that offers this analysis. How do you receive your information for the Agriculture Secretary?
Thank you for raising this, because USDA is one of our key partners that I talked about. While not a member, we have a process in place to ensure that we work closely with them, and it's important to unpack that a bit. We share visibility to USDA with all of the filings that we get. So we can ensure from USDA's perspective where there's a food security, where there's an agricultural related issue, where they need to play a part and an active role. And when they do, looking at all the filings, when they do say, look, this filing has ag implications, we bring them in just as if they were a full member of the committee, where they would be responsible for the risk-based analysis, as well as providing certifications at the secretary and deputy secretary level. So,
Thank you. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, 37.6 million acres today of U.S. agricultural land is owned by foreign investors. That's nearly 3% of all privately held land in the United States. Have you offered yourself a good review of that, and you believe that your purview takes that into account? And have you issued a report, or how would you issue a report on those 37.6 million acres that the Agriculture Department speaks of?
we'd be happy to work with USDA and look at that question. We do through the...
See, this is my point, Mr. Rosen. If the Secretary of Agriculture were a regular part of your interaction and they had a person who looked at that, you would be able to tell me, Congressman Sessions, we've looked at that 37.6 million acres because we've been working with and they're a part of our team. Now you're telling me you'll be glad to look at it. And this is the, I think, the concern that many of us on our side, meaning members of Congress, have about the sensitivity we have about this as opposed to looking forward. I hope that you will take my comments as I intended them and that you would respond back to me, and I'll accept your fair answer. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I yield back my time.
And if the witness will respond in writing to the gentleman's request. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Some have argued, and I fear the chairman was making this argument, that somehow if we invest in China and Americans are on their boards, that we will have political influence in Beijing. As former chair of the Asia Subcommittee, I'm here to say that's simply not the case. The Chinese Communist Party is not going to listen to business lobbyists. The Chinese Communist Party does not need PAC contributions in order to run in the next election. Since the beginning of this century, when we granted most favored nation status to China, we were told that if we share our economy with them gratuitously, they will share our values. That is simply not the case. The problem is that we have this enormous trade deficit with China. We have that because we do not have adequate tariffs. We have that because Walmart makes a lot of money importing from China, et cetera. And so every year we ship them $300 to $400 billion. That's close to $4 trillion every decade, and that money is sitting there. It's going to do something, and almost everything it can do is bad. But we add to that our investment policy, which is closer to the jurisdiction of this committee. Half of the foreign IPOs here on Wall Street are from China. We send our investment dollars to China. I'm looking to work with others to prohibit American index funds from investing in Chinese companies because the risks for investing in China should not be handled by paint the numbers index investing where you just automatically invest in companies. But even greater is the capital gains allowance. We provide an incentive for investors. We tax investors lower than we tax secretaries and nurses. And we do it because we want to encourage investors to build economies and create jobs by making investments in economies. And we provide that incentive to those who build the Chinese economy and provide jobs in China. So we have this undefendable, incentive for investing in China. Now, once the Chinese have this money, almost everything they can do with it, it's said, well, we don't want them to buy American farmland. Well, they can buy farmland in Ethiopia and upset our Africa policy. They can buy farmland in Russia and fund Putin's war. They can buy U.S. treasuries, and numerous articles have been talking about how Chinese ownership over treasuries is a problem. They can buy our companies, they can buy influence in Europe, or they can repatriate the money and spend it on AI technology. Once we incentivize investment in China, once we roll over and run a huge trade deficit with China, they have these funds, and perhaps the most benign thing they could do is buy American farmland. When they buy American farmland from an American, that American puts the money in a U.S. bank where it's available to build the American economy, puts the money in the U.S. stock market where it's available to build the U.S. economy. And if we do have a fight with China, we can simply seize the farmland, just as they will take hostage all of our investments in China. My question regards investment in China. The argument is we want to choke off investment to strategic sectors. But money is fungible. So how much do we accomplish by saying to an American, don't invest in an AI company in China, invest in a furniture factory in China? And then the Chinese investor, who would otherwise get the best return for investing in the furniture company, invests in AI. If we fund the non-strategic part of investment in China, won't they have all the capital they need to invest in the strategic part?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question and your interest on this important issue with regard to outbound investment to China. As this committee knows well, the President issued an executive order, and what underpins that executive order is the national security concern emanating from American investments that come with certain intangibles, branding, expertise, and the like.
So the concern is that if you incentivize an American to want to see an AI company in China do well, that American may provide the technology and the expertise, not just the capital.
That is one of the bases upon which we are concerned.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now I'll go to the Vice Chair of the Committee, Mr. Hill of Arkansas, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman, Mr. Rosen. Thank you for being here and representing the Treasury Department in front of this committee. We enjoy our engagement with your department, and in particular on something important like this. And you've seen strong bipartisan interest in the work of CFIUS, and that we're both on both sides of the aisle laser focused on making sure that it works well, is effective in protecting our national security risks posed potentially by foreign investors. So, Mr. Rosen, your appearance today is ostensibly to talk about the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRMA, which we're glad to have you. It's been 5 years since it was enacted. It's hard to believe that 5 years has gone by. But also, the Biden administration issued an EO last year, 14083, ensuring robust consideration of evolving national security risks by CFIUS. Notably, the executive order doesn't change the committee's existing legal jurisdiction or the regulatory process, but it provides guidance on the national security risk factors that CFIUS should consider. Is that your understanding of that executive order?
Yes, Congressman, the guidance coming out of that order sharpens CFIUS' focus. It's also important from a public messaging standpoint so the community understands the things that we are quite concerned about.
Good. And the risk factors include supply chain security and resiliency for 8 specific industries, including artificial intelligence and quantum computing. But it also goes on to include clean energy and climate adaptation technologies. Is that right?
I believe there's a mention of that in the executive order, Congressman.
So Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think, shows the whole world just how dangerous it could be for countries to make their essential energy dependent on a single country or a single source. And the failure to take an all-of-the-above approach to a diverse energy production portfolio or diverse geography threatens countries. And we've seen that in Europe in spades with the dependency on Russian gas, for example. But I feel the same way about our own energy security here in the United States. We passed H.R. 1 with an idea that we want to have an all-of-the-above energy strategy for decades ahead as we move to a less carbon-dependent world. So how does Treasury and the CFIUS thinking about national security risk factors as it relates to clean energy and adaptation technology? What does that have to do with national security from a CFIUS point of view?
Yeah, Congressman, thank you for the question on these factors. And as you pointed out at the top, Congress gave CFIUS broad authority to assess through its analysis what has an impact on national security. We look at all factors that may have relevance to national security. So,
would you agree that if we had foreign investment in this country that was only interested in renewables, but we have no battery storage for any renewables, and that we dislocate our baseload power, that would be a national security risk as well, right?
Well, Congressman, we have the benefit of looking at the facts and circumstances presented by each transaction, and we don't get into.
Could Total build a new refinery in the U.S.? Would you approve that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Total, the French energy company, would they be able to build a refinery? Would you approve a refinery in the United States?
Again, Congressman, it's an important.
I know it is. I'm being rhetorical. I know I'm not going to get the answer I'm seeking. I understand, and I respect you for that. But you have to understand that Mr. McHenry and I write frequently to the Office of International Affairs at Treasury about making sure that an all-of-the-above energy policy is critical to the U.S. for our own domestic needs, but also for projecting America's influence around the world. For example, the EBRD does not finance nuclear. That's not smart. And they're very reluctant to finance the Romanians or the Bulgarians' efforts to develop natural gas in their own Black Sea. I think that's short-sighted, and I think that's short-sighted at the World Bank and at the other international lending organizations. So do you agree that energy security is national security?
Certainly energy security can be national security, but again, we focus on the facts of a specific transaction.
Understand. CFIUS also considers foreign investments if they might expose personal data. I know that's in the executive order as well. Can you tell us how you're protecting health and biological data in your work?
We are focusing on this very closely. The PRC has a demonstrated intent and capability to get access to troves of American personal data for espionage and other purposes. And so anytime a situation comes up in a case that presents potential exposure and other tools are not available to deal with it, CFIUS looks very closely at that. And the
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for your willingness to testify before the committee and help us with our work. This past August, Executive Order 14105 was also released. This executive order directs the Treasury to draft regulations that require disclosure of or prohibit certain outbound foreign investments into mainland China, to Hong Kong, or to Macau. Some argue that the scope of this executive order is too narrow. They actually point out that it only covers certain aspects of advanced computing, quantum information technologies, and AI, and that much other activity, including financial investment, might not be covered. So I'd like to just get your assessment. In your view, how efficiently would Executive Order 14105 address U.S. policymaker concerns about U.S. investments in Chinese technology and their capabilities? And if there are gaps, and I realize any executive order cannot be full spectrum over every concern, but if there are any gaps that you recognize that might be covered, and just to give Congress an idea of what direction we might be looking in. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for raising the important issue of outbound investment. As you point out, this is the President's executive order, and really what underpins the executive order is a concern that is squarely rooted in national security, that the PRC in this case can use not just American investment dollars, but the know-how, expertise, and branding that comes with those dollars to help make their surveillance capabilities, their military applications, and intelligence more successful more quickly in a way that directly threatens American national security. So we share concerns about supply chain resilience and supply dependence on China, but the purpose of this executive order is to focus on a narrow set of national security objectives with the clear mandate by the president to revisit on an annual basis to assess, to your point, what gaps may exist, how can we improve it. And I think also the benefit of the notification scheme is also to collect more information and more data as one of the issues that the chairman pointed out. And so that's what underpins this executive order.
And I know we're going to revisit this over and over again, but any advice in terms of direction where you think Congress should be looking next?
Well, we think that the right policy balance was struck in this executive order. We think that we're going to learn more over time. We think these three sectors are critical to the modernization of the PRC's military and intelligence state apparatus. And so that's why we started with that focus. But of course, as we learn more, we would look forward to working with this committee to enhance the order and any follow-on legislation.
Thank you. Congress also passed the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, as you mentioned earlier in your testimony, which was intended to strengthen and modernize CFIUS and enhance its ability to address concerns involving non-passive, non-controlling investments in technology, critical infrastructure, and personal data business and real estate transactions in close proximity to military installations are part of maritime ports or airports. What is Treasury's approach to protecting U.S. critical technologies in ways that promote U.S. competitiveness? You've got this balance here, but how do we balance those needs for security, but also we're trying to promote U.S. competitiveness in those areas when we have these outstanding concerns about China's investment in U.S. and U.S. industrial policies related to tactics that acquire sensitive U.S. capabilities?
Thank you for that, Congressman. You raise a very important issue because I think the wisdom of FIRMA and what this Congress did in its enactment is make clear that we need to look at transactions on a case-by-case basis, and we need to act as a scalpel as opposed to a sledgehammer to make sure that we are doing what we can to attract all sorts of investment and addressing the particular and acute national security risks that arise, and then either mitigating those risks or if they're unmitigable, referring to the president for a block. And so I think the way Congress set up FIRMA gives us the ability to be tactical in that regard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we'll go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer. Mr. Rosen, why did the Biden administration file an amicus brief saying that the current Florida law prohibiting anyone domiciled in China from purchasing agricultural land in Florida is discriminatory?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I have a little hard time hearing you. Could you repeat the question, please?
Why did the Biden administration file an amicus brief saying that the current Florida law prohibiting anyone domiciled in China from purchasing agricultural land in the state is discriminatory?
Congressman, thank you for that question. In terms of litigation, I would respectfully refer you to the Department of Justice in that regard, but I'd be happy to sort of talk about how we deal with threats from certain countries on a case-by-case basis, which was the...
All right. Last time CFIUS was in committee, I asked him how many Americans own land in China, and if there were any, how much they owned. That was months ago. They said they didn't know and would get back to me. You've had a few months to get up to date on that. Would you please tell me?
It's the first time I've heard about that question, so I can commit to you that I will take that back and happy to get back to you on an answer, sir.
Do you believe there are any benefits from letting people domiciled in China own agricultural land in this country?
Well, Congressman, it's an important issue, and I know one that this Congress is looking closely at. Again, the wisdom of FIRMA and my mandate, as Congress has prescribed, is to look at the particular facts and circumstances of a transaction. And I can tell you that what we know about the conduct of our adversaries, including the PRC, we take a very close look at in connection with any.
But can you give me one benefit to China buying up land in our country?
Again, Congressman, it's an important issue. My job is to look at the
So you can't, okay, thank you, that's okay, I'll take that. What is the justification? Well, we'll skip that. On September 21st, 2022, the Senate, in a 96-0 vote, approved an amendment declaring that China is not a developing country and should not be treated as such by the international community, yet China continues to get loans from the World Bank and Asian Development Bank in spite of carrying on a questionable program of foreign investments in other countries. Do you know if the administration will support Senator Reissaus' bill to help end such loans to China?
Congressman, when we look at a threat as the analysis requires, we look very closely at the intent and capability of our adversaries. In the case of the PRC, what we see is very concerning, but we look at that on a case-by-case basis. So when we look...
Okay. Will the administration work with Congress so that members can get summary reports of foreign ownership by country for sectors of the economy based on their survey completed on June 30th without violating any confidentiality?
I'm sorry, you cut out, sir. I didn't hear the full question.
Okay, will the administration work with Congress so that members can get summary reports of foreign ownership by country for sectors of the economy based on the survey completed on June 30th?
We happy to work with this committee on questions or follow-up that you have. We put together an annual report that answers questions that Congress has asked. If there's more data or information that we can be helpful with, we'd be happy to follow up with you on that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Green is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the ranking member as well. And of course, I thank the witness for appearing today. Is it fair, sir, to conclude from your testimony that you believe CFIUS has sufficient authority to address national security concerns posed by foreign persons and foreign entities investing in the United States? I think you've spoken well. I think you've been very clear. Is it fair to conclude that you believe that you have sufficient authority?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for the question and your attention to these important matters. I do think, thanks to the good work of this committee and Congress, we have a robust set of authorities that I outlined earlier: control jurisdiction, but also what was expanded upon in FIRMA, non-controlling, non-passive investments, and certain real estate jurisdiction. Those are important authorities. We are always looking at our docket. We are looking at what is happening, and we are always assessing and reassessing where we may be able to improve. But I think the committee has a strong set of authorities to be able to protect national security.
Thank you. I mention this because I, in my state, had the legislature to propose restrictions that would be directed toward specific persons. And it created quite a stir, because while the people who pass these laws don't have to interact with the people who can suffer from some of the consequences that may not be intended. Persons of Chinese ancestry, for example. When you start using specificities of this type, there are people in this country who suffer. They suffer in terms of how people approach them generally, but they also suffer in the sense of consternation as to what they will do with land that they currently hold, or will they be able to purchase additional property? I think that allowing 50 states to enact laws regulating land purchases by foreign-born persons puts our entire country at risk of retaliation because of actions taken by a single state legislature. We've had one legislature to conclude that no one who is a non-citizen will be able to purchase property, real estate. 50 legislatures acting independently on issues that can have foreign policy implications, in my opinion, is a very dangerous thing for us to allow. We cannot allow persons whose motives may be less than honorable to pass laws that can impact the entirety of our country in just one state. This is why I and the Honorable Judy Chu introduced H.R. 3697, a preemption bill that will prevent states from acting what appears to be in an arbitrary and capricious fashion. I believe, I will not speak for her, but I am honored that she would support the legislation. I believe that we have a duty and an obligation to allow CFIUS at the executive level to deal with these issues because you have a broader view. You have a better understanding of the geopolitical implications of allowing one state to make a decision that can impact the entirety of the people in the United States of America. So I'm grateful that you believe you have the authority, and I'm grateful that you are flexing your muscles, and I would concur with the ranking member. If you can flex even more, I think we'll have a better result. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. With that, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Rose, for being here today. I'd like to start out my discussion this morning with you by letting you know I sit on the China Select Committee as well. And we had an interesting discussion the other day with two dissidents who were at the Tiananmen Square protest years ago. One wound up in jail for 7 years, another one for 16 years. And we asked those gentlemen the question, what can we do, the United States, do for the Chinese people? Because our argument is not with the Chinese people, it's with the Chinese government / Communist Party. And 5 words is what we got back. Quit helping the Chinese government. You could have heard a pin drop. That's what our mission should be. Stop helping the Chinese government. I made that comment to, I think it was the Department, or the Deputy Secretary of Commerce the other day in our hearing like that. She had no idea what I was talking about because they don't understand, and Mr. Sherman made very, very articulate about this, and Ranking Member Waters also made comments to the fact that we've got to stop investing in and helping China. To that end, let me begin my discussion this morning, Mr. Rosen, with the comment that was made in August 23. The Wall Street Journal published a troubling article exposing the internal divisions and flaws in the CFIUS review process that ultimately gave the Chinese Communist Party access to sensitive technology that Defense Secretary Austin warned could fuel cutting-edge weapon systems. And with that, I ask unanimous consent to submit a copy of that article to the record and without objection. Specifically, the article covered DuPont's sale of a sustainable materials business to a Chinese company which CFIUS approved despite intense opposition from the DoD and the intelligence community due to national security concerns. So my question, Mr. Rosen, is why were DoD's and the intelligence agencies' warnings essentially ignored? Are the Treasury and Commerce departments better equipped to assess national security risks than DoD?
Congressman, thank you for that question and raising the issue of compliance as a general matter with our national security agreements. When I came into this job, I made monitoring and compliance one of my top priorities, monitoring national security agreements. And that's because the agreements that we set in place are only as good as those that can be complied with. And so that's why, for the first time ever, within about 100 days, we issued our first ever penalty and enforcement guidelines to make clear to the public, but also to establish.
Was the penalty on this particular entity?
As,
Because that's my next question.
yeah, as I've talked about earlier, I can't get into any particular matter by statute in this open setting, but
This is already in the Wall Street Journal article here. I mean, this is common knowledge at this point. And I understand that you reached an agreement with the Chinese purchaser to set up a separate entity in which the information would be held, and everybody thought this would all work. And in less than a month, the Chinese had the information. It had slipped through the cracks and off they went. And so the question then is, did anybody at CFIUS get fired over this? Because where's the accountability? Where is the ability for the CFIUS to hold people accountable for these sorts of things? You made a deal and you just said this. Is somebody going to be held accountable for this deal here?
Congressman, again, thank you for raising the important issue of compliance and monitoring. What I would say is Congress prescribed a very specific and robust analysis to assess national security consequences to transactions. Congress also made 9 members a part of CFIUS, and so we engage in a very robust risk analysis in every single case, putting aside any particular transaction.
Well, along that line, Mr. Rosen, I would hope that you'd learn your lesson from this situation. Number one, don't trust anything the Chinese government is involved in or may be even touching. But you mentioned a while ago in your testimony that there's 3 separate threats that you look at, and one of them is the potential threat emanating from the foreign investor. Well, the Chinese government has a plan, a 100-year plan now to take over the world. And it includes taking over the United States. That is an imminent threat, I would think, especially look at all of the actions that they've taken over the last 25, 30 years. And what they're doing right now is even more concerning. And yet we don't look at that as an imminent threat and say, no, 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 no. To me, if I was in your shoes, if it had the word China in any sort of proposal, it'd be an automatic no. Absolutely positively do we not want to help China in any way whatsoever. Imagine, for an instance, if instead of the word China that you were talking about, it was Nazi Germany. Would you be approving it then? I think not. Why would we be helping our enemy? That's the question. And remember what those folks said. Quit helping the Chinese government. With that, I yield back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the ranking member for this hearing, particularly because all around the country, at least certainly I can speak for my congressional district, although I think it's of significance all around the country. And it has been, I think, crystal clear for some time now that foreign actors are using social media to sow discord and even present divisive information, trying to get us fighting with one another. And it's reaching us a large swath of America. And my concern is that there are many people in our country, me included, that would consider this to be a significant threat to our national security. And so I'm wondering, would foreign investment in U.S. telecommunications, such as Twitter or Facebook or X or YZ, whatever they call it, this new alphabet deal, would that trigger a CFIUS review?
Congressman, thank you for the question and this important topic and raising it. As I mentioned earlier, there are sort of various aspects that we can get jurisdiction. One is, irrespective of the U.S. business that's being invested in, if there's a controlling investment by a foreign person, that would give CFIUS, into a U.S. business, that would give CFIUS jurisdiction. The second way, as it relates to your hypothetical, is in the authorities that Congress granted us in FIRMA in 2018, expanding our jurisdiction to encompass certain non-controlling investments into critical infrastructure, critical technology, or companies that would have certain amounts of sensitive personal data. And so Again, it would depend on the facts and circumstances of the transaction, but Congress was very clear in expanding our jurisdiction to direct us to look at those kinds of investments that would give us jurisdiction.
I'm not sure a lot of research has been done, but I did stumble across something from Oxford University, which reported through research that there are over 70 countries in the world right now that are engaged in manipulating social media. And almost any meeting I go to, there are going to be there are parents there talking about social media in another realm. But it is becoming at least clear to me, and I think everyone, probably even you, that this is something that deserves our strong attention. And so I'm wondering if international companies have made and are continuing to make significant investments in the U.S. healthcare sector, and I don't think we need to become an isolate in the world, but I mean they create jobs, and research leads to significant discoveries that can prolong life in the country and so forth. I'm not against that, but I am concerned about the social, the security issues. What happens with these acquisitions of U.S. healthcare companies? Does that fall under the scope of being a potential national security concern?
Well, Congressman, first of all, the issue around healthcare companies can raise a whole host of issues. One that comes to mind is sensitive personal data and access to Americans' sensitive personal data. We know certain adversaries are trying to exploit that data for their own purposes against the interests of the United States. And so it would depend on the facts and circumstances of the particular transaction, but certainly investments into healthcare companies when we have jurisdiction would be something that we would look at to assess whether a national security risk.
But can you look at it without, I mean, when they're, you're back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Michigan. Mr. Izinga is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to appreciate Mr. Rosen for being here today. In 2013, China's largest automaker at that time was given U.S. government approval to buy a company, Michigan-based company called A123. That was a battery company back then. And are you familiar at all with that case or that name?
Not sitting here today, Congressman, no.
No? Okay. I would encourage you to take a look at that. In fact, I was pulled into a classified briefing on that and a CFIUS review of that. Well, earlier this year in a hearing before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, which I also serve on, I had the opportunity to revisit that A123 deal with Undersecretary of Commerce Alan Estevez. In response to my questions, the Secretary noted that the A123 approval was, and I'm going to quote him, quote, probably not the best decision that CFIUS made, close quote. I would agree, and at the time I was very critical of the deal, especially after the classified briefing that I and a few others had received. And I think the conclusion then and now is that American taxpayers should not be funding technology that will in turn be used in competition against American enterprises. And now you fast forward a decade, and here we are, and it seems that we're still struggling with many of the issues that the A123 deal brought to light. And in August of this year, another battery maker, Gotion, whose parent company is backed by the CCP, acquired 270 acres in Green Charter Township in the middle of the Lower Peninsula in my home state of Michigan. And at the time, unofficial reports stated that Treasury concluded that the Gotion deal to purchase the land was not a covered transaction, which they define as a, quote, a purposed or pending transaction with any foreign person, which could result in the control of a U.S. business by a foreign person. Secretary Rosen, are you familiar at all with the Goshen deal that is happening in Michigan?
Congressman, I'm happy to sort of get into what I can in the setting, reserve the balance for a closed door setting.
So, but you're familiar with it?
I have read public reports.
Okay. And are you aware that some have expressed, obviously, concern about proximity of Goshen's land purchase to military installations in Michigan?
I'm generally aware of the public reporting on the matter.
All right. Does CFIUS have the ability to review foreign purchases of land that pose a surveillance risk to U.S. government sites?
As a general matter, Congress gave CFIUS real estate jurisdiction for transactions in close proximity to sensitive facilities, and that's as identified by the Department of Defense and other committee members.
So that's yes. Okay. So do you believe CFIUS should have formally reviewed the Goshen deal?
Well, Congressman, what I want to do in this setting, and again, I will reserve for a future setting, is to talk about any particular transactions, but it's important to
okay, well, let's be more general. Should CFIUS be able to review deals like this that have been described?
Congressman, what I would say on this important issue, and I know it's important to you and it's important to me as well, what I would say is CFIUS has certain jurisdiction in close proximity. There's also certain areas that Congress was very deliberate not to provide CFIUS with jurisdiction over. For example, greenfield investments, licensing arrangements, and the like. And so what I'm trying to do is execute Congress's mandate from a jurisdictional aspect. I share your concerns deeply about PRC access and control to our critical technologies, and it's something that we're very focused on, and I'd be happy to follow.
So very briefly, do you believe that is sufficiently tight enough, that you have enough authority, that the parameters are tight enough that you can review deals like this Goshen deal?
What I would say is I believe that the authorities that Congress gave us are strong, they are robust, but it is not unlimited as Congress designed.
Okay, well, I'm going to close with this in my last few seconds. You know, Michiganders and Americans, frankly, rightly are concerned about the CCP buying up land and utilizing taxpayer dollars in our states and elsewhere. And, excuse me, and if CFIUS cannot learn from past mistakes or fully understand the adversarial nature of the CCP, I believe CFIUS needs to be modernized even further, and we need to review that and meet our current national security risks and the challenges that we face today. And so, as you noted, we are going to be going into a executive classified session later on today, and I will have some follow-up questions on this specific topic that I will hold for now. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That we recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And you know, as you look at the balance you have to do, I think it's important that we recognize the tremendous benefit that the U.S. consumer realizes from the integration of our economies with not only China but less developed countries throughout the world. You know, anyone who says we should make everything in the United States, I invite them to come up with a business plan to make a microwave oven that will retail for $42 and that is manufactured in the U.S. with high-paid labor. Okay, we just have to be realistic about these. On the other hand, putting pressure on the system towards friendshoring of these industries, I think, is the right direction. You're an important part of that. Now, you have to evaluate these purchases or investments, both for their the nature of the foreign government involved and also for the national security relevance of these. And this is really tough when you get into dual-use technologies. You know, for example, things like drones, which can be used to deliver groceries or deliver hand grenades. Wow. Is that? And so now, and it gets even tougher when you talk about technologies you mentioned, like quantum computing. Now, how do you actually get the expertise you need to understand whether a given quantum computing investment is, you know, just sort of an abstract theoretical thing versus something that actually might be of near-term use? And do you have trouble getting the expertise you need?
Yeah, Congressman, it's an excellent question and topic, and it's one that, as Congress set up, CFIUS is well suited to address, because with our 9 permanent members, in addition to access to other executive branch and agencies, we have access to subject matter experts across the agencies to help us understand, is a product dual use? Does the business even know it's dual use? But maybe somebody at DoD has identified a dual use. And so we leverage across the federal government the subject matter experts to make those determinations. And it's critical in our analysis to understand what those uses are, and also to understand, as you point out, the balance. What are the commercial benefits of the technology? How are those used? And that goes into both our risk-based assessment about what the risk is, but also what the right outcome in the matter is.
Yeah, and just what was previously mentioned about Goshen, for example, they just announced a $2 billion battery factory that they're going to be making as an investment in Illinois. And this, it's my understanding, will be pretty much a copy of technology that they already use, and there won't be I don't believe, a big national security downside of this. There are also, we have to acknowledge the huge benefits that we get when we get foreign investment from any location. You know, when any individual or company comes in and buys farmland anywhere in the United States, as Representative Sherman mentioned, you know, the American that sells that land gets to put that money in the bank or into other investments that will grow the U.S. economy. And so you have to, I think we have to look at this in a more balanced way than we're seeing right here. Do you get, now back to the issue of getting the technical expertise, because in issues like the attempts that the previous administration made in trying to shut down certain kinds of scientific collaboration, you know, they frankly sort of covered themselves in shame by not having the technical expertise that was necessary to understand what was truly a national security risk and something which someone without the expertise thought it sounded bad. And so are you getting the responsiveness that you need and the expertise that you need from the agencies, or do you need a bigger club or a bigger carrot or a bigger stick to get more responsive, high quality analysis of that?
Yes, Congressman, I think one of the benefits of having 9 members is not only do we have 9 active members, but they're all quite active. We have full engagement from the committee, which is important. We can leverage the expertise across the members. We can get experts, for example, at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, or at the Department of Defense, or at the Department of Commerce. And so we are able to dig into these issues, which provides us very important facts and analysis for us to come up with that determination, which very much relies on that.
I see that as being a satisfactory relationship. I mean, you do get the responsiveness you need, because there's always a danger if it's not the agency's main line of business that say, okay, this is sort of noise, we got to respond to it, but we're not going to put our best people on it fast. Or do you really, you're pretty satisfied with that?
I'm quite satisfied, and that's in part because of the relationships that we have. There are assistant secretaries at the various agencies that I engage with on a regular basis to make sure we...
Good to hear. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we'll go to the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Rosen, thank you for being here today. Congress enacted the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA, and the Export Control Reform Act, ECRA, in 2018, which I supported to ensure that our export and investment control regimes were fit for the challenge of safeguarding against predatory Chinese investment and business practices. These laws reflect the most comprehensive updates to CFIUS and the first, I think, long-term reauthorization of U.S. export controls in decades. Congress crafted these reforms to improve CFIUS's ability to, I'd say, connect the dots when investigating and mitigating the serious national security risks posed by countries like China. Mr. Rosen, how would you describe China's strategy when it comes to its investments in the United States, and how have the 2018 reforms helped CFIUS better approach transactions involving China and other strategic competitors?
Congressman, thank you for that question very much. What we see is what the intelligence community sees. It's what the FBI has talked about. We see a PRC with a demonstrated intent and capability to use any and all means, legal and illegal, seen and unseen, to gather U.S. critical technology and anything else that it deems in its national interest.
Any and all, legal and illegal. These are strong words. Since these laws were implemented, sir, have you seen Chinese companies restructuring their transactions in an attempt to prevent CFIUS from using its new authorities under FIRMA and DECRA?
Well, I want to be careful and reserve part of the threat discussion for the classified session, but what I would say is that we are working very hard to stay on offense. That means understanding what our adversaries are doing, how they are doing it, how they are trying to evade our jurisdiction, and how we can stay ahead of it. And that is a good portion of how I spend my day and trying to think creatively, which this committee and Congress plays a critical role in terms of coming back and regularly reassessing our authorities, regularly reassessing where we can be stronger.
Do you think are CFIUS's current authorities sufficient to catch and address attempts to skirt its review?
I think our authorities are well calibrated to address the threat that Congress has identified and that we are working to address and assess. That said, we're constantly looking to assess whether we can enhance our authorities through regulations under the umbrella of FIRMA, or even whether we need statutory changes.
Well, you need to keep us informed regarding this because it's extremely important to our national security and our future. Assistant Secretary Rosen, according to the CFIUS annual report, there were 8 covered transactions involving China and critical technologies in 2022, though it is unclear whether this includes refilings. Has CFIUS approved any investment giving China access to critical technologies?
Well, what I would say, Congressman, is that CFIUS will never approve a transaction unless it resolves any and all national security risks that it identifies. Critical technology and the PRC being very high on our list.
Good. Again, Assistant Secretary Rosen, when assessing national security risks, CFIUS seeks to know who the ultimate owner or parent company might be. Does it prove more challenging to determine these facts when a Chinese investor is involved?
It can be. Ultimate beneficial ownership, a very important topic, as you point out, is critical to our work. We have ways to get at that information. We have access to databases, public and private. We also have a system set up that the parties are very incentivized to provide us any and all of the information that we need, and we have the ability to test that as well.
Is it as challenging when a Russian investor is involved, sir?
Well, anytime you have a foreign investor with a demonstrated intent and capability to get at access of critical technology in any and all ways, we want to be very careful, we want to be very circumspect, and we are.
Lastly, if a foreign investor connected to adversaries like Russia, China, or Iran seeks control of the U.S. business in the agriculture sector, do your current authorities allow you to review these deals for national security risks?
The short answer is yes. When a foreign person seeks to get control of a U.S. business, that triggers CFIUS jurisdiction.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Ohio. Ms. Beatty is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member, and thank you, Mr. Rosen. We've kind of taken you all over the issues here on this issue, so I want to try to get in 2 questions, one on the outreach to the business community. Can you tell me more about that? Because I'm always concerned about whether we're doing sufficient outreach to the business community to ensure education, awareness, compliance, and federal regulations and the process. So to what extent have firms indicated confusions over CFIUS procedures and determinations? And what kind of outreach to the business community has Treasury and your partner agencies done?
Congresswoman, thank you for that question. And we spent a lot of time talking about risk, but this is also a very important component to what Congress has set up and required us to do. These regulations, these laws, they're cumbersome, they're confusing, but intentionally so to make sure that we act as a scalpel to address the risk. And so we spend a lot of time engaging with the business community, engaging with our international partners, educating on not just sort of the nuances of the regulatory framework, but also on the risk factors that are important. And that's why the president's executive order from last year was one of the reasons why it was important. Messaging to the public about the ideas the issues that we are concerned about, critical technology and the like, how we view these risk factors is important so that businesses can continue to operate, they can continue to invest, and they can continue to do so with a real-time understanding of issues that may get CFIUS's attention.
It's interesting, you mentioned the executive order, which almost a year ago to date. If you're talking about the executive order, I think it was 14083, which expanded the national security factors considered by CFIUS. So can you tell me if the new factors were included the examination of transactions' effects on the resilience of United States critical supply chains and the technological leadership or aggregate industry investment trends, cybersecurity risks, or risks to the United States person-sensitive data?
Yes, I mean, that executive order added factors that Congress started a very good list in Section 721F of our authorizing statute. That executive order added to that, but also highlighted and sharpened CFIUS's focus on some of these very important issues. For example, cybersecurity and data, a real area where we see more and more transactions presenting risk as it relates to U.S. personal data, which we try very hard to keep safe and out of the hands of our adversaries and those that would do us harm.
Are there any specific ways that you can tell us that it has had an effect, the executive order has had an effect on the reviews in practice?
Well, of course, Congress gave CFIUS the ability to look at any factor that CFIUS deemed appropriate. I think one of the various benefits of the executive order was to sharpen the committee's focus on some of these issues about emerging threats and emerging technologies. It's also to be able to show and tell to the public the issues that we are concerned about. And so we spend time talking about it, but we make sure that we look at the factors, again, on a case-by-case basis as it may raise national security risk.
And lastly, and maybe in part you've answered this, but can you tell us if there are any ways that CFIUS has improved coordination with the allies and partners in information sharing or in the investment screening efforts mandated by FIRMA?
Yes, Congressman, another very important area. We have an entire office dedicated to this kind of international engagement. Since FIRMA has been enacted, we have helped other countries stand up their own versions of inbound screening, over a dozen of them. Excuse me. We engage in regular interactions, technical exchanges, tabletops, and of course, we have used the accepted foreign state status that Congress provided in FIRMA to bring, as of last year, all of our Five Eye partners into that structure. And we have regular engagement and active engagement because we recognize that the more that we do here in the United States, we want to prevent spillover, backfill of these issues to our allies. And as a result, we engage very closely with them.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And Assistant Secretary Rosen, you're doing a good job. Appreciate the work that you and your team are doing at CFIUS to screen malign investment, particularly from China. But as a author of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't offer some constructive feedback, both in terms of CFIUS being under-inclusive in its screening and also over-inclusive. So let me start with under-inclusive. Grand Forks Air Base. It is disturbing that it took the Air Force commander and Congress to motivate CFIUS to list Grand Forks Air Base in North Dakota in its regulations, and that such a glaring threat to U.S. national security wasn't immediately on CFIUS's radar. I do understand that that CFIUS has now expanded the list of sensitive sites, but I am worried that CFIUS could be focused on the wrong activities targeting benign foreign investment, but miss such a glaring major national security threat on our home soil. So why did it take the Air Force and Congress to apply pressure for CFIUS to begin investigating this real estate sale, acknowledging that ultimately CFIUS did block the transaction?
Congressman, thank you. I appreciate the exchanges that we've had on this important issue. Your leadership on FIRMA has been instrumental. I think you raise important issues. And what I would say is Congress set up a system for establishing jurisdiction in close proximity to sensitive facilities. We have developed a list-based approach, as you have identified, and we rely on our partners to provide us with updates to what are sensitive facilities. There is an active engagement. That engagement has become more active as of recent, and we are in close contact with our partners at the Department of Defense and elsewhere to make sure that we are going to and do regularly update the list, relying, of course, on their expertise to do so.
Thank you, Secretary, and look forward to, in the classified setting, talking about the list of sensitive sites. In terms of the other category of maybe being a little bit over-inclusive, as you know, Congress authorized CFIUS to exempt certain categories of foreign persons known as accepted investors from the expanded jurisdiction and mandatory filing requirements. To qualify as an accepted investor, that person must, among other things, be associated with an accepted foreign state, such as Five Eyes nations. And the practical utility of the program, though, has been, we think, limited by some onerous eligibility criteria. For example, not only must investors be organized under the laws of and have their principal place of business in an accepted foreign state, but an investor must also be able to demonstrate with respect to itself and its parents that the majority of its voting and economic interests are held by nationals or entities of an accepted foreign state or the United States, and that any individual or entity holding more than 10% voting or economic interest is a national or an entity of an accepted state. This requirement poses challenges for publicly traded companies which typically have little visibility into the identity and nationality of under 5% individual shareholders. So the question is, how many, if any, investors have qualified for the accepted investor status?
Congressman, the accepted foreign state framework that you put into place in FIRMA has been very important. We have been working to implement that. In terms of specific numbers, happy to look at the annual report and look at our data and provide updates. I do think, though, however, that looking not just at who the investor is, but issues behind that are important to our analysis to assess risk. But if you see an issue in this area, I'm happy to look at it and work with you and continue to work with you to make sure that we are addressing the national security risk while also achieving Congress's intent with accepted foreign states.
Well, you got a tough job because we want to invite the benign investment, but also screen out some of this more malign investment like we saw at Grand Forks. Final question. On the executive order on investments in national security technologies and products in countries of concern, can you describe the role of the Office of Investment Security and CFIUS in the implementation of that executive order? And this is a bit of a follow-up to the chairman's questioning, because we do believe that OFAC should be the primary point on outbound investment.
Yes, Congressman, thank you. So the way that I lead the Office of Investment Security, the primary function of which is CFIUS and leading that effort, it is envisioned that the implementation of this executive order will reside outside of CFIUS, but within the Office of Investment Security, working closely with our partners in OFAC, given the IAPA authorities. But that's the answer to your structural question.
My time has expired. What we need is clarity for investors. Green light, red light, not a bureaucratic black hole. With that, my time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kasten, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. Thank you, Mr. Rosen, for your time today. There was a report in January of this year that CFIUS was reviewing Binance's proposed $1 billion acquisition of Voyager. Binance has since withdrawn that proposal, but the reporting said that CFIUS was reviewing on the basis of national security concerns. Are you able in this format to give us any color on why you were reviewing and what concerns you had with that transaction?
Congressman, the short answer to your question is I would reserve that to the closed-door setting.
Okay. Well, maybe we can follow up on that offline then, or some other more appropriate setting. I asked the question really to make a larger point, that last year there were reports that North Korean hackers stole more than $1.7 billion of cryptocurrency. I think over the last 5 years, that's been something like $5 billion. There's been public reports from U.S. intelligence officials that more than half of North Korea's nuclear missile program has been funded by cybercrime and crypto theft. It's of course not, we know that there's similar crypto theft and money laundering crypto networks that are driving Chinese productions of fentanyl compounds. We know that Iran has been using crypto to get around some of their sanctions. Wall Street Journal reported that Binance has actually been assisting Russia in evading sanctions. The public, and recognizing this is not all of it, but the public reporting is that the crypto market has at least $20 billion in illicit transactions. So my question for you in your capacity is, if we know that North Korea is stealing billions of dollars worth of crypto and using Chinese money laundering networks in order to fund their nuclear program, is it safe to say that that poses a threat to national security?
Well, Congressman, these issues around crypto and the actors that you identified are very concerning and ones that we similarly take very seriously. We would look at these kinds of issues in the context of a particular transaction. And so, for example, one of the things that we look at is third-party risk, right? And so let's just say you mentioned hacking activity, right? We may be concerned about a foreign acquirer that may on paper not pose a particular concern, but we know that certain entities are trying to hack them and steal intellectual property or crypto and the like. And so I think we really need to look at this through a lens of the facts and circumstances of the particular case, but this issue of third-party risk and who the investors are and where it's coming from are issues that are very much on our radar.
Yeah, I mean, I've been only half joking to some friends recently that as long as we have anonymized wallets, all blockchain really is a lousy accounting technology because you can't track the record of transactions. In April of this year, the Treasury Department released a report. The title was Illicit Finance Risk Assessment of Decentralized Finance. And they specifically flagged that there are loopholes within the Bank Secrecy Act that need to be closed to the extent that they allow these distributed finance, blockchain crypto companies to fall outside of the scope of the BSA's definition of financial institutions to facilitate money laundering and other things we'd like to protect against. So I guess what I'm curious is, do you agree that we need to strengthen the Bank Secrecy Act and fix those loopholes so that we can prevent our adversaries from laundering money, evading sanctions, and potentially funding terrorism?
These issues, Congressman, are very serious and ones that I know my colleagues at Treasury take very seriously. The BSA, of course, as you know, is administered by FinCEN, which is outside of my direct domain. I know these are issues that they're concerned about and they're focused on. I'd be happy to talk to them about following up with you.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure that you all and all the agencies have the tools to address it. And I tee that up, number one, to thank my colleagues in the Senate, Senator Warren and Senator Roger Marshall, who have just introduced a bill, which we will be co-introducing in the House shortly, to close those gaps in the Bank Secrecy Act, make sure that we don't allow people to use crypto to skirt anti-money laundering rules so that we can have a robust national security presence. Would welcome any support or guidance you have on that, and I would invite all of my colleagues on this committee to join me in that effort to see if we can make this bipartisan and bicameral and close that barn door that we know is open. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Rosen, for being here today. The United States agricultural sector plays a vital role in our national security, and this sector contributes significantly to our economy stability, and it's responsible for our nation's food security. The increase of foreign investors we've talked about today, purchasing farmlands to try and gain control of U.S. business in the agricultural sector is a growing threat. In my home state of Texas, foreign entities control more than 4.7 million acres of land, and that's a concern that my constituents have. And should any hostile nation want to cause permanent harm to our food supply chains, this avenue provides them with the means to achieve it. CFIUS has jurisdiction over real estate purchases, we've talked about that, and leases near military bases and sensitive government sites. Any acquisition of land in the U.S., particularly near military installations, must be handled with caution and genuine oversight. So question, could you elaborate on the current process CFIUS uses to review these deals, and how does your committee determine if a foreign purchase of agricultural land is a national security risk?
Thank you, Congressman. And this is a vital issue. Issues, as you point out, like food security in our supply chain, agricultural security and the like, are very important issues that we take very seriously. And so, and let me unpack that. There's a couple of ways that we get a jurisdiction in these challenges. One is through our control jurisdiction. Any foreign person acquiring control, broadly speaking, not defined as 51%, for example, of a U.S. business, an agricultural business, for example, would provide us with jurisdiction to review the matter. As you point out, our added real estate jurisdiction that Congress provided us would also give us jurisdiction to review pure real estate transactions within close proximity, sometimes up to 100 miles of an Air Force base. And we've got 875,000 square miles of coverage in that regard. And what we would do when we do have jurisdiction is look to our partners at the U.S. Department of Agriculture to provide us insights and expertise and help us assess the transaction in terms of assessing who's doing the buying, what is the threat from that individual or entity, what are they buying, an agricultural business, farmland, et cetera, and what is the specific impact to national security? That's the analysis that Congress requires us to go through. And we would look very closely to our partners across the committee, including at USDA, to help assess that, and we've done just that.
That's good. Harder the better. There's no question that China is a hostile nation towards the United States, and that their goal is to weaken our country in any way possible. And the interference and aggression coming from the Chinese Communist Party poses a significant threat to U.S. financial systems. Now, our lack of information on China's economy and the CCP's continued abuse of the system in place is jeopardizing our national economic security. There is a huge and a large cloud of uncertainty surrounding the Chinese financial sector, their investments, and industry practices. So this Congress, I championed the legislation to address these threats by requiring an analysis on the risks presented by the Chinese financial sector, along with a report providing recommendations on strengthening internal cooperation to monitor and mitigate these risks. So we must hold China accountable for their abuse of the financial sector. I think we all agree to that. So the question would be, has CFIUS ever had to recommend the prohibition or mitigation of a real estate purchase or lease by a Chinese investor?
Congressman, it's a good question, and I would want to look at some statistics, but I'm quite confident that various instances of a control transaction or a real estate transaction, we've had experience in terms of mitigating. Did you say? I'm not sure if you said mitigate or refer.
Either or.
Yes, I'm quite certain, although I'd want to confirm.
You might look at that and get back with us on that, okay? In the time I have remaining, real quick, can you highlight the kinds of mitigation measures CFIUS would consider for a semiconductor deal involving the Chinese?
Well, PRC investment into a U.S. semiconductor company, while I don't have the facts in front of me, would raise a lot of questions and analysis in CFIUS likely. The kinds of things that we would look at from the threat perspective is who's doing the buying. You obviously said it's a PRC entity, so we would look at the intent and capability of the actor. It would be very concerning.
I yield my time back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen, for joining us for this hearing. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States certainly plays an important role for our national security by sounding the alarm on foreign control of critical technologies and industries. I want to build upon and follow up on Ranking Member Waters' question line regarding the committee's view on a country with many human rights abuses that seems to have evaded significant scrutiny, and that's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a sovereign wealth fund called the Public Investment Fund, which has more than $35 billion in American companies like Amazon, Walmart, Rideshare, and the food delivery company Uber Technologies, as well as the major ticketing platform Live Nation Entertainment. Now, recently, the Saudi-backed Live Golf announced a merger with PGA. Mr. Rosen, I certainly do appreciate that much of the work is classified, but what can you share about the Committee on Foreign Investment's posture towards Saudi Arabia, these investments, and reviewing the potential national security risks that are associated with them?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question and your focus on this issue. As a general matter, I'd like to respond with a couple of points. One is that CFIUS was enacted not to be country-specific, but to look at the specific transaction in terms of who is doing the purchasing and what we know about them. But Congress, in addition, in its wisdom, singled out foreign government-controlled investments to pay special attention to and to create additional requirements when it is a foreign government entity or foreign government-controlled entity doing the buying. And we look very closely at those transactions when we have jurisdiction. And then the other point that I would make, which is really essential in our analysis, which Congress requires, is what is being purchased? What are we worried about? Are we worried about U.S. person-sensitive personal data, for example? Are we worried about the transfer of technology, like critical technology? Are we worried about access to critical infrastructure or a sensitive facility? And so these are the kinds of factors that we look at in any analysis, but I think it's important to highlight the foreign government control piece of this as well.
Right, I appreciate that. Asked the question just because I, did think that the jurisdiction was clear and was there, and really just seeking transparency. Just none of us want to be caught flat-footed here, so I appreciate your question there. But I do just want to double down on the fact that Saudi Arabia is an oppressive regime. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, human rights watchdogs reported that Saudi Arabia killed hundreds of Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers who tried to cross the Yemen-Saudi border between March 2022 and June 2023. Additionally, a report by the U.S. intelligence community concluded that the Crown Prince, who oversees these investments, approved of the operation to murder Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. In light of these human rights abuses, Saudi investments in U.S. companies, especially those in critical or sensitive industries, clearly warrant greater scrutiny. For example, building upon the question line of Congressman Cleaver, Saudis hold significant stake in Twitter, or whatever Elon Musk is calling it now, and Twitter is within your jurisdiction to review as a global social media giant that has sensitive personal data on Americans and is a major communication platform for government officials, including the President and your agency and the Department of Treasury. Do you agree?
I would agree that we have jurisdiction to review foreign investment, controlling investment into a U.S. business, Congressman.
Very good. So bearing that in mind, then, has the Committee on Foreign Investment reviewed any investments by Saudi Arabian companies and nationals into Twitter specifically?
Understand your question, Congresswoman, and these issues are important. They present complex issues, and they require a specific case-by-case analysis. Of course, FIRMA put in place strict confidentiality requirements, and so whatever we can get into in a classified and closed setting, I would respectfully defer to that.
Fair enough. In the end, Saudi Arabia should not be able to sanitize its image by sports washing, nor should it be able to gain sensitive data by investing in American companies. We need a review of these investments, and I hope the Committee on Foreign Investment will scrutinize the Saudi Arabian government like the human rights abuser that it is. Thank you. I yield.
Gentlewoman yields. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for purpose of asking questions. Mr. Rosen, thank you for being here today in your long career in national security. It's a very important topic. Understanding some of the sensitive nature, any questions that I ask that the answer may not be suitable for a public setting, I understand. Please just let me know and we can address these later today. I first want to ask you about the CFIUS June 2023 report on committee activities in the prior year. That would be the activities of 2022. As you know, Section 7C of FINSA requires an annual report on foreign direct investments in the United States by entities from foreign countries that comply with any boycott of the State of Israel. In 2022, the committee identified 16 transactions involving investors that comply with a boycott of Israel, including one transaction involving investors from Iran. Can you elaborate on the nature of these transactions at a level that is suitable for a public setting?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I think putting in place these requirements for the annual report were very important. We take a lot of time, we look at a lot of data, and it's important for us, and we appreciate that. Specifically, I'm not prepared to address that here, but would be happy to follow up.
Okay, we'll address that later this afternoon. At a high level, is there any idea that, and maybe we need to do all of this in the setting, but did any of these, maybe at a very high level, did any of these raise significant national security concerns?
Well, what I can tell you is that whether they were in connection with these transactions or other transactions, we would take a very robust review of, again, the purchaser, the threat in connection with that purchaser, and what is being acquired, what is the U.S. business. And so we would very much scrutinize any such transaction looking at those issues that Congress has prescribed. And again, happy to follow up in a closed door.
Thank you. And the last question on this topic, in this section of the report, you mentioned that CFIUS could not independently verify the dollar value of 3 of the 16 transactions, meaning the total value of 7C transactions exceeds that which was reported, I assume. What particular barriers did CFIUS encounter that prevented CFIUS from independently verifying the dollar values of those transactions?
Well, as a general matter, sometimes we will run into a transaction that presents a sort of odd restructuring, for example, and it may not be your typical merger or acquisition transaction. And so in some cases, it could be that. In some cases, it could be that the information wasn't available. But again, with regard to these particular transactions, we'd be happy to address that in a closed setting. If we can't, we'd be happy to get back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the most difficult aspects of policymaking is balancing free and open investment ideals with national security concerns. CFIUS has the authority to lighten certain regulatory burdens on investments from certain friendly countries. For now, CFIUS only extends these relaxed standards to the so-called Five Eyes countries which directly partner with the U.S. on matters of national security and intelligence. As much as you can you explain the specifics of how these standards are relaxed for investors from Five Eyes partners?
Yes, and thanks to Congress for giving us the tools to be able to execute on that. As a general matter, when a country is an accepted foreign state, what that does is relieve investors from that country if they meet certain qualifications and criteria from certain aspects of CFIUS. So, for example, the expanded jurisdiction that Congress importantly provided over certain non-controlling investments into critical technology, critical infrastructure, sensitive personal data companies. If you qualify as both an accepted investor from an accepted foreign state, you might be exempt from that, for example.
Okay. I have the feeling my remaining questions would probably be more suitable for the secured environment. So at this point, I'll yield back the balance of my time and recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Assistant Secretary Rosen for being here and offering his testimony today, and I look forward to the afternoon session with him also. Foreign direct investment has played a key role in the Texas economy for nearly 2 decades. As of this year, over 1,700 foreign corporations are doing business in the state. And that's no surprise since the Houston area, which is the area I represent, is also one of the most diverse regions in our country. It is home to many first and second generation immigrants and their families representing regions from all around the world. In Houston alone, over 5,000 companies are engaged in international business, and approximately 1,000 Houston firms report foreign ownership. Additionally, Houston recently ranked 5th in best cities for international business, according to the Financial Times. All of this has created more than 110,000 jobs in Texas since 2015. As the interagency committee that reviews these types of foreign investments, your agency plays a critical role both by protecting our national security and by facilitating the approval of these major investments. National security is critical. That has got to be your top priority. The challenge for CFIUS is ensuring its effective exercises in oversight of bad actors without discouraging foreign investment that creates these jobs and boosts our economy as it does in Texas. So my first question really is much of the concern of others with regard to real estate transactions. The Port of Houston and the Houston Ship Channel in Texas is home to multiple strategic seaports. Houston is also home to a large hub airport, a world-renowned medical center, and as I noted earlier, a area of much investment. So certain real estate transactions by foreign entities in proximity to ports are also reviewable by your organization. Does CFIUS Review Authority for Real Estate require additional clarification from Congress? And I ask this question because this last year, Mr. Undersecretary, there was legislation in Texas, Senate Bill 147, that would totally ban land sales to dual citizens and businesses associated with adversarial nations, including China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Is state action like this harmful, helpful, or a distraction to your mission, or does Congress need to step in and further clarify any of the authority that you might have with regard to real estate transactions?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, for the question and for raising this important issue of real estate jurisdiction. And it is quite important, and Congress recognized that important in 2018 when it granted CFIUS this real estate jurisdiction for the first time, because it wanted us to have jurisdiction of installations and facilities in close proximity to sensitive facilities. Since that time, to execute on that mission, what we have done is work with our partners at the Department of Defense and elsewhere to essentially create a list and assess what facilities around the country should sit on this list. They can have jurisdiction of up to about 100 miles of jurisdiction from a particular facility to get at things like surveillance, espionage, and others. And I think that the authorities are well suited to address those risks in that regard, but we also need to stay on top of it. So just recently, we updated our list of sensitive facilities to respond to the evolving nature of the facilities, how they change, and to make sure that we are regularly assessing which sensitive facilities we should have on the list to make sure that we have jurisdiction when we need to from a national security perspective.
Right, but my question was specifically to regard to any state legislative action. Is this helpful, harmful, or distraction, or are we just going to sit back and let the states continue to file pieces of legislation like this?
Well, Congressman, what I would say is my role is to address the national security risk at the federal level, irrespective of what occurs in the states. And I can commit to you in the committee that we will continue to do that. We will continue to assess the national security risk from a real estate perspective, from a controlling jurisdiction perspective, and from a non-controlling perspective. And so that, in my mission, is what I'm focused on, to make sure that we are not allowing any transactions over which we have jurisdiction over to proceed unless we have resolved any and all national security risks.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you. Yield back.
Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary, I appreciate you being here, and also look forward to the part two of this. But in this public setting, hopefully I can stay focused on things you can answer here. If not, obviously we'll cover later. But looking through your 2023 annual report to Congress, some interesting observations. Roughly 50% on average since 2018 of the notices and declarations wind up with investigations. And then of those, a fair number, once there is an investigation, actually almost half of those, 41% of those actually end up being withdrawn for some factor. So I guess, how do you assess what you do follow up and do the investigation on, And then what's behind that number of the percentage that just say, yeah, we'll withdraw? What's going on there?
Congressman, it's a good question, and I appreciate any time somebody digs into the data and the annual report. They're important data points that Congress has prescribed. So what I can share is that I'm quite proud that nearly 60% of the transactions we review clear in the 30-day declaration period or the 45-day initial review period. It is true that many matters go into investigation and some withdraw. The matters that go into investigation are when we cannot determine that a clearance is appropriate at the 45-day mark. That may be because an agency needs some additional time to conduct a risk analysis. That may be because we've identified a risk and that we need to do more work in that regard. And so we work very closely as a committee to make that investigation assessment, is the first part of your question. The second, with regard to withdrawals, they can occur in a number of circumstances. The parties may decide that they need more time to assess what CFIUS is considering, for example. And one of the things in that data, which is important, is you will see a larger number of withdrawals than you will of refiles. Because oftentimes, when we assess that there's a risk or a concern and we are prepared to refer a matter to the president, the parties will just voluntarily withdraw and abandon the transaction or voluntarily withdraw and divest a transaction short of a presidential referral. So there is more to unpack in those numbers.
Yeah, thanks. And no presidential referrals in 21 or 22, and as far as I know, not in 23. Anything to see there?
Only to reiterate my last point, which is that does not mean that CFIUS has assessed that a transaction cannot proceed or needs to be unwound from a national security perspective, because rather than face a public presidential order of divestment, many times the parties will voluntarily withdraw to go away.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. One of the things that complements this was, beneficial ownership reporting. And, frankly, that focuses on, companies that really have 20 employees or fewer. Some concern that there's shell companies there. Ultimately, everyone has to report at least once, but the companies that a lot of the scrutiny's on with a handful of employees. What's the status of the rulemaking for that? When will this take effect? Because talking to my constituents, whether they're big businesses or small businesses, or frankly even CPA firms, they don't really know much about this.
Congressman, the issue of ultimate beneficial ownership is critical to CFIUS's work. I know it's critical to our partners at other regulatory agencies, including FinCEN, which is working on this rule, of course, within Treasury. Beneficial ownership is a very important part of what we do. We need to assess who the ultimate owner is of the foreign acquirer, and so that we can fully and adequately address any potential risk. And we have means to do that. On your specific question about the rule and the timing, that's not something that's within my domain, but I'm happy to talk to my colleagues at FinCEN and see if we can get back to you.
Yeah, so you're doing it now, even in the absence of this new reporting requirement, I guess, is part of the point that I wanted to make. And many of the members of the committee, certainly me, we felt there was a smarter, better way to do it than the ultimate way that became law. And, we'd certainly be open to modifying it because, frankly, I think you have some of the smallest, least sophisticated businesses that will ultimately be subject to jail time and massive fines. Not that they will be targeted, but they could be. And I think the last thing I'd just like to bring up is sensitive real estate. I think we'll probably go deeper in there, but could you talk a little bit about, it's not like China comes and says, hey, I'm from China, I want to buy this sensitive property. How do you begin those review processes?
So
the gentleman's time has expired. If you could respond in writing for the record.
Yeah, I think in depth will probably be in part 2, but thank you. My time has expired and I yield.
Gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Assistant Secretary, thank you for being with us this afternoon, I think now. We all know, and I think in your testimony you talked about the expanded criteria, factors that have been now taken into consideration since 2022 with the President's action. And one of the things that kind of stood out for me is that from 2017 to now, was it like double or triple the number of case law? Is that correct? Can you talk a little bit?
Nearly double. So in 2017, we had a number of transactions. I can get you the exact number in the 200s or so. And just last year in 2022, we had 440 filings, the most ever, in part due to our expanded jurisdiction.
Well, Assistant Secretary, well, how would you because you don't have the capacity. You don't have to, I mean, I don't know if you would have the capacity if you have the same number of folks on your team or working in this area. And then, you know, to see again, because the criteria expansion, which is necessary for national security, how do you prioritize those I say caseload, sorry, I'm a social worker at heart, so I say caseload. How do you prioritize what you're going to work on first and what is priority for?
Well, we too call it a docket and cases and, all the rest. As a former DOJ prosecutor, I'm sort of familiar with the dockets. But what I would say is the resources that Congress has provided have been instrumental in making sure that we can implement FIRMA, building out our non-notified capacity to identify transactions that were not brought voluntarily to the committee, to building out our monitoring, enforcement, and compliance functions, for example. Building out our staffing to address it, which we continue to do, and we are continuing to grow to address our broader case docket, but also the broader priorities. We talked about accepted foreign state status, working with our allies. We've talked today about engaging with stakeholders, working with stakeholders. We need capacity to be able to do all of this. And so as we continue to grow, we do need to prioritize the threats to national security, and that's why you know, the genius behind FIRMA and the case-by-case review and looking at specific risks arising from transactions, I think gave us strong authorities to respond.
So Assistant Secretary, under the expanded jurisdiction, you know, y'all have authority now, includes non-controlling investment in U.S. companies that maintain or collect U.S. citizen-sensitive personal data that can have an adverse effect on national security, correct?
Correct.
So, I mean, we know that the companies have a tremendous amount of control collecting this data, and, you know, this is where I'm like mostly interested in protecting our residents, you know, privacy and so forth. Would it be accurate to say that y'all engage in, is it enough to like engage in what they call one-off bans or interventions and investments which may pose security risks regarding that particular factor?
Well, when we look at that factor, Congresswoman, which is, I agree, is a very important factor, what we are looking at there is what is the vulnerability of the U.S. business, but we juxtapose...
Like getting hacked into.
Or who's going to get access, right? Who is the individual or entity or government that's going to get access to that information? And what do we know about their intent and capability to exploit that data to the adverse national security impact of the United States?
Okay. Yeah, because one company, I mean, literally that data is going to be moved to another company that the constituent or resident they didn't get a right to say whether or not that information can continue. Anyways, would the national security risks facing the U.S. from foreign direct investment be reduced if there were stronger personal data privacy or security protections in place? For example, if you know, residents or U.S. consumers or users had a say in how their data was collected, sold, and stored by private companies?
Well, Congresswoman, it's an important issue, and this issue around data is really important. What I think is relevant to the discussion here is that Congress established CFIUS to be a tool of last resort. One of the things that the president has to find in order to act under CFIUS is that there are no other laws or adequate authorities to address the risk identified. And so
So you're familiar with the European Union's, like they call it the General Data Protection Regulation. It's considered one of the strongest, in the world's strongest data protection rules. Do you agree? Are you familiar with their rules?
I'm generally familiar with, I think, what's known as the GDPR.
Yeah.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Okay, I'll send you the data because I really want your input about what the European Union is doing.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rosen, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thanks, Secretary Rosen, for being with us. Mr. Rosen, it is my understanding that the Director of National Intelligence is only a non-voting ex officio member of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Could you comment on the current role that the DNI plays, and specifically, does she have sufficient time to be able to review some of the transactions that come before CFIUS?
Congressman, thank you for that question and raising the important partner of ODNI in our work. They are indeed a critical partner in our work, and they are a non-voting member, as I understand it, as prescribed by Congress. But that does not mean that they are not a very active participant and important player in our work. What they do is they provide a threat assessment in connection with every single transaction that is covered under our jurisdiction, and provide us critical intelligence so that we can assess the threat posed by the foreign acquirer.
And would it be helpful for the DNI to play a more active role in the CFIUS process?
Well, Congressman, they do play quite an active role in the intelligence function that they play, and I think, you know, and I don't want to get inside of Congress's head here, but my understanding is that given the intelligence nature of what they do, their role is to be objective intelligence providers in connection with transactions as opposed to sort of weighing in on policy.
How does CFIUS coordinate its activities with other U.S. government agencies that have a role in protecting national security, such as the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security?
We are synced up, Congressman, very closely. Each agency has dedicated teams. I have dedicated Assistant Secretary counterparts that we meet with regularly, that we review cases with regularly, that we correspond with and talk on the phone. And so, but it's not just at my level, it's at all levels that regular meetings and engagements on our robust case docket do occur.
The President has the ultimate authority to prohibit or suspend a covered transaction if the President feels there is credible evidence that the transaction would threaten to impair national security and could not be addressed using authorities in other laws. Mr. Rosen, what controls, if any, are in place to ensure that a president with conflicts of interest could not allow a transaction to go through that would benefit himself or his family, even if it threatens our security interests?
Well, in terms of what controls may be on the president, I may refer you to the Department of Justice or somewhere else for that. What I can tell you is that we, within CFIUS, have a very robust, fact-intensive process where we look at the facts, we look at the law, and we look at the intelligence. And we have a number of national security professionals that help inform that. And then if we determine that a case can only be resolved by referral to the president, we get together, again, as a committee to assess the facts and the law and the threat.
But it's safe to say that oversight of the president's ultimate authority would rest with Congress or with outside of CFIUS. Is that a fair statement?
I may not want to get into the separation of powers issue, but I will say that I think there is a very robust objective analysis that goes into any referral to the president.
In what ways has CFIUS improved coordination with our allies and partners in information sharing and in investment screening efforts as mandated by FIRMA?
Yeah, the short answer is a lot and very closely. We have helped our allies and partners stand up more than a dozen of their own inbound screen regimes since FIRMA has come into place. We regularly engage with them. We provide feedback. We provide technical assistance. And when appropriate, we do share information, as permitted through the intelligence process. We also engage in informal discussions with them, and we have a whole team within the Office of Investment Security that's charged with not just maintaining those relationships, but growing them and making sure that our allies and partners not just have tools and laws on the books, but that they're executing against those laws, right? We want to see action and activity associated with those laws to protect the national security of not just the United States, but our allies and partners as well.
FIRMA authorizes CFIUS to impose filing fees on transactions to cover the committee's funding needs. Have these fees been sufficient to cover your actual costs in 8 seconds?
I don't have that particular analysis in front of me, but I'd be happy to look at that, Congressman.
Thanks. If you could respond for the record, I'd appreciate that. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nickel, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much. Thanks for being here. Safeguarding our nation's interests and preserving the integrity of our our democratic principles are among my top priorities in Congress. I understand the need to address the potential implications of foreign entities acquiring farmland, particularly those from countries like China. While it's essential to inspect foreign land purchases to ensure they pose no threats to our national security, it's equally important to approach any potential legislation with care and consideration. Before I begin, I want to just draw a clear distinction that I think is important for my role and my approach to this issue. While we discuss our concerns about the actions of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party and specific corporations, these concerns should in no way reflect upon the hardworking, dedicated, and patriotic Chinese American citizens who contribute daily to the fabric of our country. Our dialogue here today and every day should be guided by facts, by the desire to secure our national interest, and by a deep respect for every individual, regardless of their national origin. And the rising tide of anti-Asian discrimination is very troubling for me. It touches many of the people that I represent in North Carolina's 13th District, and we owe it to the Chinese American community in the United States to be very precise in our language, fair in our judgments, and unyielding in our commitment against any form of racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination. But we certainly have some concerns about farmland, and I want to get into that. I have a few questions. But first, I saw on your bio you went to Colorado?
Undergraduate at the University of Colorado, yes.
Have you been following the football team?
Hard not to.
Did you think at the beginning of the season they'd be 2-0 right now?
We're all very excited about the progress there.
I mean, it's been a real story. But back to the questions. Given the rising trend of foreign entities, particularly from China, investing in U.S. farmland, can you tell me more about the measures that Treasury is considering to ensure that these investments don't compromise our food security and our national interests?
Congressman, thank you for raising this issue, which is quite important, particularly this issue of food security, agricultural businesses, when they have national security impacts. And the committee has various tools to be able to address these issues as prescribed by Congress. Of course, our jurisdiction is not unlimited as prescribed by Congress, but the ways that we get at these issues are through our controlled jurisdiction, which is a foreign person acquiring control of a U.S. business, like an agricultural business, would give us jurisdiction to review a particular transaction. And as we've talked about here today, the jurisdiction that Congress provided in FIRMA to give us enhanced or new real estate jurisdiction over pure real estate transactions in close proximity to a sensitive facility. And close proximity can mean upwards of about 100 miles. And so we have jurisdiction in that regard over some 875,000 square miles of coverage in the United States. And what we do in either case is look at the nature and facts of the transaction, because we need to address specific national security risks. So we look at what entity or individual is doing the purchasing, and then what is being purchased and what's the potential exposure from a national security perspective. So, for example, food security, critical food supply chains, and the like would be things that we would look very closely at in circumstances where we've got jurisdiction to do so. And it's an issue that we take seriously. I know it's an issue that this Congress and this committee is spending a lot of time on, and it's an important one.
Thanks. We've heard from users of the USDA's Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act data have noticed inaccuracies and underreporting under current disclosure requirements, and limited information is available on data covering land held by certain countries that provide tax-neutral jurisdictions for private equity firms like the Cayman Islands and BVI. Why is this data limited or incomplete, and how is this impacting our national security?
Well, Congressman, it's an important question. I think for some of it, I would refer you to USDA, but what I would say is ensuring that we have a robust information and information collection process to understand what is the scope of these transactions that are occurring, what is the nature of these transactions, what is being purchased. And so I understand there's some discussion about a reporting requirement and making sure that businesses are reporting transactions to the agriculture. The more information that we can get to assess whether it's a transaction that is covered by CFIUS and whether there's a potential national security risk is very important to our mission.
Thanks so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Assistant Secretary Rosen, thank you for being here. On September 15th, 2022, Executive Order 14083, aimed at strengthening CFIUS's ability to assess and respond to evolving national security risks and foreign investment, explicitly acknowledging that certain countries employ foreign investments as a means to gain access to sensitive data and advanced technologies, which poses a national security threat to the U.S. Furthermore, this executive order established a clear link between the roles, activities, and capabilities of CFIUS in broader national security priorities, such as safeguarding U.S. technological leadership, ensuring the protection of American sensitive data, and bolstering the resilience of the U.S. supply chain. One of the executive order's goals is to harmonize and reinforce the various tools and objectives within the United States cybersecurity strategy, thereby fortifying the nation's ability to respond effectively to evolving threats. More so than ever, I think everyone agrees, it's clear that cybersecurity is indeed national security. So, Mr. Rosen, along those lines, how has that directive affected CFIUS's work and protocols specifically in relation to cybersecurity efforts?
So, Congressman, thank you. Issues around cybersecurity and data security and the like are very important and issues that we see emanating more and more, particularly in today's age where we have technology and data flowing back and forth between businesses. And the President's executive order was important for a number of reasons, but chief among them was highlighting these issues like cybersecurity. And while CFIUS has the authority to look at all sorts of factors, ensuring that CFIUS is laser focused on cybersecurity and data has been critical. So what does that mean in our day-to-day work? What that means is what we're looking at is access to sensitive personal data that an adversary or concerning foreign acquirer may get, and making sure that we are addressing that either through mitigation or blocking a transaction. But we're also worried about broader cybersecurity issues like a foreign adversary getting access to offensive cyber capabilities that a U.S. business may have. And so we are thinking about this issue of cybersecurity and data quite broadly, as I know this committee in Congress has been doing.
Thank you for that. How does the executive order interact with congressional forums such as FIRMA and the ECRA?
Well, the executive order is guidance to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And importantly, it's the first time that there has been such guidance issued to CFIUS. Of course, we operate under our statutory mandate of FIRMA. That's what determines what our jurisdiction is. That's what determines what analysis we go through, and that's what determines what our sort of broader authorities are. And so they interplay together in an important way.
And after the executive order, has CFIUS placed an increased emphasis on cybersecurity?
So what I would articulate it as it has sharpened our focus on these kinds of issues like cybersecurity. We have been looking for a long time at issues like cybersecurity and data, but not just does it sort of sharpen CFIUS's focus, but also play an facing role to the investment community, to transaction parties, to understand that if they are engaged in a transaction, and they should be looking at these issues as well: cybersecurity, data security, what are the capabilities of the U.S. business? And so it was important from both directions.
So in the time after the executive order, or just in the last few years in general, what cyber risks has CFIUS found to be most prevalent during your reviews?
So, Congressman, again, it's a good question, and it's an evolving one. It's part of our effort to be nimble and stay on offense and stay attuned to emerging threats as they present themselves. And so the kinds of cybersecurity issues that we're focused on, I mentioned a moment ago, but they include cybersecurity tools, offensive tools as well as defensive tools, understanding how our adversaries could acquire those tools and use them against us is part of our analysis. Now, of course, we're also focused on third-party risk as it relates to cybersecurity. So we may have an acquirer that's buying something, and we may not have a particular concern about the acquirer, but we may have information that there's third-party risk because the acquirer has been hacked multiple times. They don't have an adequate cybersecurity program in place. And that's one of the issues that we focus on sometimes in mitigation. And so, you know, this issue around cybersecurity has a whole host of implications, and there's various ways that the committee can get at that.
Sure, thank you for that. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stiles, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for being here, Assistant Secretary Rosen. When we think about CFIUS, in many ways, we're making sure that we are safeguarding the United States and balancing that with not being overburdening in an unnecessary way on the economy. A couple things I wanted to dig into here on the home stretch of this first part of the panel. The number of cases requiring mitigation has jumped nearly 70%, even in the past 2 years or so. Why are we seeing such an increase in the number of transactions requiring mitigation, in your opinion?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for highlighting this issue. There's a number of reasons we're seeing more mitigation. We are seeing a range of threats that are evolving. We're seeing a range of vulnerabilities that are evolving. Data and cybersecurity, as we just talked about, is an increasing challenge when we think about the types of transactions that occur that don't involve sensitive personal data. Those are a meaningful number, for example, and oftentimes we believe that we need to mitigate those types of transactions. And the nature of the transactions are evolving. And the other aspect is we are refining our approach. We are taking a very, very close look at these transactions, and we are not clearing them without mitigation or referral when necessary.
How do you monitor that mitigation? And are people in compliance with the mitigation agreements you strike?
We have a good, solid track record of compliance, but we also have a growing amount of enforcement and compliance personnel. One of the first things I did when I came into this job is put out the first ever penalty and enforcement guidelines from CFIUS, both to establish a framework for how we would look at breaches to national security agreements, but also to send the message that we are going to actively be looking at this. And so anytime now there is a breach of a national security agreement or a violation of our authorities, we conduct an analysis to assess what, if any, enforcement action we should take.
And do you believe you have the resources necessary to conduct that review and enforcement?
We are fortunate to have bipartisan support from a resource perspective. It is a resource-intensive issue, and we want to make sure that we maintain robust resources to do that. And it's an area that we're growing in right now.
Let me shift. Appreciate that. Let me shift gears slightly here, and in particular, talking about the jurisdictions where we're seeing these filings. We've seen pretty significant increases from places like Singapore, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, et cetera. And obviously, those are small populated countries, but obviously significant in business filings. And so, to what extent is CFIUS concerned about the use of third-party countries to invade intensive scrutiny, and how do you approach that?
It's a good question. Ultimate beneficial ownership is the key to much of our work, to assessing and getting behind the veil of who is doing the purchasing. And so in each transaction, we will peel that onion as far as we need to go to make sure we understand who is behind each transaction. So Cayman Islands entity, we're often looking at beneficial ownership that is not Cayman Islands, right? And so before we make a decision, before we finalize our risk assessment, before we figure out where we're going to take a transaction, peeling that onion is critical to our work, and we won't do anything until we do.
And as you're looking at that beneficial ownership structure, you're peeling the onion, as you say, are you? I assume you're working with our allies to conduct that review. Can you comment on how that coordination with our allies operates, in your opinion?
Well, in terms of the ultimate beneficial ownership, we are relying on multiple databases, commercial and private. We're relying on certifications under penalty of perjury from the parties. And when necessary, yes, we are engaging with our allies as appropriate to share intelligence and to consult them consistent with our confidentiality obligations and otherwise. But engagement with our allies in this aspect of our work and more broadly is also a key piece of what we do.
But is that a substantial piece of the work, engagement with our allies? Is that an area that we should consider that there should be additional effort put forth by policymakers?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that Congress wanted us rightfully to do is help stand up other regimes so that as we get tougher, our adversaries just don't go to our allies and partners to get the same critical technology.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'd like to thank our witness for his testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witness to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for his response. I ask our witness to please respond as promptly as you are able. Pursuant to our earlier vote, we will close the remaining portion of this hearing to members and designated staff I identified earlier. The second panel will be conducted in HVC 301 of the Capitol Visitors Center immediately following the first series of floor votes. The committee stands in recess.